Hello everyone. I'm Keith DeStone, and welcome to another installment of the Cosmos Society Online Open House series. We're very honored to have as our guest today Dr. Denise Demetriou, who is Associate Professor of History, Ancient Greek History, I should say, at UC San Diego, and has been the director of UC San Diego's own Center for Hellenic Studies, and is a current fellow at the Harvard Center for Hellenic Studies, where part of her project is a book. She's working on her book that is, let me just read it to make sure I get it right. Her book explores how migration and mobility transformed the Mediterranean in the 4th century BCE, using evidence related to Phoenicians living not only in the Greek world, but all around the Mediterranean. Hence today's topic, immigration and belonging. Phoenician immigrants in 4th century Athens. So Denise, I previewed to you that I would ask you this question at the beginning here. And could you tell us what first sparked your interest in the classical world?
Yeah, it's been an interesting trajectory, I guess, in some ways, because when I was in college here in the US, I was majoring in chemistry. In fact, I did major in chemistry. At some point in my junior year, I just couldn't really figure out what I would do next, which I think for like the current generation of students graduating from college must sound very strange. But for me, it was, I think I just wasn't inspired by it to sort of have the imagination to figure out what I would do next that would make me happy. And so I started taking classes in my second semester of junior year in ancient Greek, and also a course on ancient Greek mythology and religion. And it was taught by the same professor. This is Becky Sinos at Amherst College. I guess I will name her because she's been a wonderful mentor to me. And she was fantastic. She just opened this whole new world to me that I just wasn't aware that existed. And I could see immediately that I could spend the rest of my life dealing with these texts and, continue to be inspired for a very long time. So that's kind of how I got into it. Then I had to catch up because I had to learn all the languages before I could get into grad school. But that's how it started.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It's always very inspiring to hear those stories. So I should let you begin. Please go ahead. And I understand you're going to share your own screen when the time comes.
Yeah, thank you. So, I'll start that now. And let me start the slideshow too. Okay. Can everyone see the PowerPoint? Yeah, thank you. Thank you for confirming that. So as Keith said, thank you for inviting me, first of all. This is like a great pleasure to present my work to you. And as Keith said, this talk comes from the current book project that I am working on, which basically starts from the presumption that migration and mobility were common in the ancient Mediterranean, and that they intensified in the 4th century BCE. And I think that both of these phenomena basically changed the social landscape of the ancient Mediterranean. So what I'm interested in general in this project, sort of if I had to pick the biggest question that I'm asking, it's, what were the effects of mobility and migration, especially in the 4th century BCE when this phenomena become more intensified. And we've have quite a few books that have come out in the last few years on immigration, but they focus mostly on literary sources and mostly on Athens. And they've yielded lots of insights on especially Athenian political culture and the exclusionary politics of this culture. But what I am interested in more is actually looking at what the immigrants themselves were experiencing, and what they can tell us about their experiences. Did their identities change because they were immigrants? What was their relationship with the host state that they lived in? And how did their presence change the states that they were living in? So those are the questions that I ask in general in my project. And what I will talk about today is a history of immigrants from Phoenician city-states, mostly Sidon, Kition, and Ashkelon, just because of the sources that I want to concentrate on today. And so focus on these immigrants from these Phoenician city-states who lived in Athens. And we actually have a large number of immigrants, of Phoenician immigrants who lived in Athens, and they left behind more evidence than other immigrant groups. And because of this, they make a good case study to look at the effects of migration in this period. And what I'm going to do is basically kind of walk you through the handout that I sent in advance. I'm going to begin with the story of Zeno, who was the founder of Stoicism, who emigrated from Kition and lived and taught and died in Athens. Because this particular story, I think, reveals some elements of the immigrant experience that our sources are mostly silent about. And that's the fragility of the immigrant experience in a new place, anxiety regarding one's status and one's identity, and also the stereotyping and hostility and insults that foreign immigrants experienced, even in Athens, which was one of the most multi-ethnic places in the ancient Mediterranean in this period. And once we talk about that particular text, I'm then going to turn to a series of bilingual inscriptions in both Greek and Phoenician from Athens to show how Phoenician immigrants negotiated their presence and membership in Athenian society. And I'm going to use these bilinguals to make basically 3 points. The first point is that Phoenician-speaking immigrants adopted or created practices that allowed them to adapt to migration as individuals. And I'm going to discuss the practice of name changing, so adopting a Greek name or Hellenizing it or translating one's Phoenician name into Greek. And I'm also going to talk about the adoption of local Athenian artistic styles on funerary monuments, on Phoenician funerary monuments. Second, I want to show how immigrants formed communities, immigrant communities, that were centered around professional trade associations that ended up mediating between the host state and the members of the association. And finally, what I hope to show is that migration actually led to the construction of new identities. These practices, these adaptive practices, and these institutions like the trade associations actually facilitated the belonging and membership in Athenian society for these immigrants. But at the same time, what we see on these texts that I'm going to share with you is that the use of the Phoenician script and the Phoenician language and also Phoenician aesthetic styles as well on their monuments actually demonstrates the persistence of a Phoenician identity. And the trade associations that I will discuss provided this cultural hub for these communities of Phoenician speaking immigrants. So the adaptive practices of Phoenician immigrants actually coexisted with new modes of articulating immigrant identities. So the first text that I sent to you is composed of just some excerpts from the biography that Diogenes Laertius wrote about Zeno of Kition, the founder of Stoicism. And that very first passage, I think, is really great because it just describes the spectacular fashion in which Zeno arrived in Athens. And as the story goes, as Diogenes reports it, is that Zeno was on a merchant ship, which was actually carrying the quintessential Phoenician product, which was purple dye. And the ship was wrecked off the Attic coast while it was en route to Piraeus. And I just really like this because Diogenes just immediately jumps from saying this to then talking about Zeno shipwrecked, walking to a bookstore, going inside this bookstore, reading Xenophon's Memorabilia and telling the bookseller, I want to find, a teacher like Socrates. And the bookseller, directs him, almost just wants to get rid of him, directs him to this philosopher, Crates, who then becomes Zeno's teacher. And elsewhere in the biography, we find these little tidbits that say that Zeno may have been a moneylender, that his father was a trader, and all of these professions are professions that that basically were associated in the ancient Greek world, and not just the ancient Greek world, I should say, with Phoenicians. So they are always described as being bankers, traders, right, and dealing with money and wanting to make profit. So immediately we are in this world that actually uses the stereotypes about Phoenicians, even in this late biography. But then as we read more of this text, we also see that Zeno's Phoenician origins and the fact that he was a foreigner in Athens were both undesirable and even damaging traits in this biography, as Diogenes reports it. So his teacher, Crates, in one of the other anecdotes that I shared with you, calls him Little Phoenician, right? In Greek, it's Phoenikidion. But it's a derogatory term of endearment, basically, this term. And Diogenes describes him as stingy, and he says he was stingy because he was a foreigner. And a rival philosopher named Polemon actually accused Zeno of plagiarism. He says, you walk into my school and listen, and then you take the ideas and you Phoenicianize them and make them, your own. And this all culminates in the last passage that I sent to you, which records this epigram that one of Zeno's students wrote after his death, which essentially tries to downplay Zeno's Phoenician origins. And it ends with, I forgot, I wanted to show you this image of Zeno in Larnaca, or Kition, ancient Kition. But the epigram actually ends with the following lines. It says, "What reproach is there if your fatherland is Phoenicia?" Right? Did not Cadmus also come from there, from whom Hellas has writing? So from this text, we can see, I think, pretty clearly that Zeno's foreign origins from what was a predominantly Phoenician city-state on Cyprus were a handicap for him in Athens. And this example of this famous Phoenician immigrant in Athens, right, the founder of the Stoic school of philosophy, I think reveals pretty clearly the stereotyping and prejudices that immigrants must have encountered on a daily basis. But if we look at epigraphic texts from Athens, these bilingual Greek and Phoenician texts, what we have is the voices of the Phoenicians themselves. And these texts present a different viewpoint from the literary texts where, we can see, and we can be pretty sure, I think, that without doubt, Phoenician immigrants experienced negative stereotyping and prejudice. But they don't talk about this in the texts that they themselves produced. What the epigraphic corpus of these bilingual inscriptions really shows is the changing modes of identification because of migration and the adaptive practices that mediated the immigrant experience. So that's what I want to turn to now. And the first adaptive practice that Phoenicians in Athens adopted was name changing. And we see this very commonly on 4th century bilingual funerary inscriptions. So for a while, I'm going to be talking about funerary tombstones, basically. So we have a few individuals, a few Phoenician immigrants in Athens who transliterated their Phoenician name using the Greek alphabet. But most of them actually translated their Phoenician name into Greek, Hellenized it by adding Greek endings, proper Greek endings to, Greek endings of proper nouns to their names, or they just adopted a completely unrelated Greek name. So we have to think about why this practice might have been appealing to them and why they adopted it. And I think that it may have allowed them to avoid or overcome prejudice, hostility, some of the xenophonic sentiments in Athens, or at least to lessen these sentiments. A Greek or a Greek sounding name might have given them a cultural or even economic advantage. They might have acquired more class mobility, more job opportunities, more prosperity, the creation of better and stronger professional networks. But at the same time, what we will see on these stones is also that the use of the Phoenician language persists. And I think this shows that these Phoenician immigrants didn't hide their origin by changing their name. In fact, the fact that they use the Phoenician language, I think, means that it became a marker of Phoenician identity or immigrant identity in what was, in Athens, which was a predominantly Greek-speaking state. So I want to use one of these bilingual inscriptions to illustrate the different kinds of name-changing practices, or at least how Phoenician naming practices in Greek and how we see them on these texts. I'm going to concentrate for now on this top part of this tombstone, and I will come back later to this relief later on in the talk. But here is a closer look at the text, the bilingual text that's on top of this relief. And what I want to point out is that the bilingual text names both the deceased and the person who actually commissioned the tombstone. The Greek text appears on top, the Phoenician one below, and the Greek text identifies the deceased as Antipatros, the son of Aphrodisios, the Ashkelonite, and the dedicator of the text of the tombstone as Domsalos, the son of Domano, the Sidonian. And the Phoenician text identifies the deceased as Shem, son of Abdashtart, the Ashkelonite, and the dedicator as Domselech, son of Domhano, the Sidonian. So if we look at these names in more detail, we can see that Domselech in Phoenician Hellenized his name into Domsalos, right, by adding the masculine Greek ending. But he actually just transcribed his father, so he's Domano in both cases. And the name of the father of the deceased, Aphrodisios, is actually a very good translation of the Phoenician name Abdashtart. Abdashtart means servant of the goddess Astarte. Astarte was often identified by both Greeks and Phoenicians as the Greek Aphrodite. And so Aphrodisias is a really good, is a fitting translation for Abdashtart. And then Shem's name has nothing to do with his Greek name Antipatros. So we can see that there's really no standardization. Some people, few people actually, when we look at the inscriptions, just transcribe their names or transliterate them, but most people Hellenize them or translate them or choose an unrelated Greek name. Now, if we move to some of the other bilingual inscriptions from Kition this time, we can see the endurance of Phoenician traditions, but also the adoption of Greek funerary customs by Phoenician immigrants. So this is one example, but there's a second tombstone that's very similar to this one. It looks exactly the same. And both tombstones record the name of the deceased as Numenios the Kition, but their Phoenician names are actually different. The one that you see on this slide here is called Ben Hodesh, which means son of the new moon. And the other one, which I don't have an image of to share with you, but again, it looks very similar to this one. His name was Mahdash, which means from the new moon. And Numenios also means of the new moon. So it's a really good translation of both of these Phoenician names. And it also happens conveniently to be a pre-existing Greek name. The Greek inscriptions on both of these texts are very brief, as you can see, just as Numenios the Kition. But the Phoenician text is a little longer on both tombstones. On the one that you see here, the Phoenician actually says, describes Ben Hodesh as the son of Abd Melkart, son of Abd Shamash, son of, we don't know what that name stands for, the Kidian. So basically it includes multiple generations of his ancestors. And that's a very typical way of Phoenicians to identify themselves on texts from Phoenician city-states in the Eastern Mediterranean, but also Carthage as well. But most of the bilingual texts that we have from Athens and other places of the Greek world, on most of them, the Phoenicians actually identify themselves with just the name of their father and their city ethnic, just as the case that we saw before of Antipatros, son of Aphrodisios, or the other Kidian bilingual that looks like this one, just identifies Mahdash as the son of Penesimiltion, the Kidian. So this is a typically Greek habit of just identifying oneself with a patronymic and a city ethnic. And it seems that the Phoenicians who lived in the Greek world actually adopted that practice of providing these shorter genealogies, with a few exceptions, such as the one that you see here, which actually retains a more Phoenician practice. So even though we have the use of the Phoenician language and the persistence of the Phoenician language on these texts, at the same time, we see that the deceased or the person who is commissioning this text at least adopts a Greek practice. And we have, I'm not talking about all the bilinguals that we have, but just a small selection of them. And another one, also for a man from Kidion, shows the translation of Phoenician names into Greek again, but also the translation of Phoenician divinities into Greek ones. And we've sort of seen one example of Abd Ashtart, who, the servant of Astarte, who, that's what his name means, who changes his name to Aphrodisios. But I think this kind of translation of divinities also makes the meaning of the names more the Phoenician names more comprehensible to the Greeks who may be reading these epitaphs. So another bilingual from Kidion records the name of the deceased as Heracleides, which is a name that was very common among the Phoenician diaspora in the Greek world, which was a translation of the Phoenician name Abd Melkart, which you actually see on this stone as well, that's still on the slide that you can see. Melkart was the Phoenician equivalent of Heracles. So Heracleides was a very good translation of that name. So what we see is that the Phoenicians translated the name of people born under a new moon into the Greek name that meant the same thing. They recognized Greek Aphrodite as the analog of their Phoenician Astarte, and they identified or saw, in the Greek Heracles, they saw their Phoenician Melkart. And this translation of these theophoric names, so names that bear names of divinities as part of them. So this translation of Phoenician theophoric names into the Greek equivalents reveals, I think, that the Greeks and Phoenicians who were in contact because of migration and mobility had become intimately familiar with each other's divinities. And we have to ask whether this practice of name changing was actually a voluntary behavior. And I think it's pretty doubtful that Phoenicians in Athens or anywhere else in the Greek world would be able to pass as Greeks, basically because of their linguistic skills, their Greek language skills. I think that Cyprus was probably the one place where bilingualism was really common. And I think maybe things were different there, but not in other places. And in fact, we saw quite the opposite when we looked at the story of Zeno and how he was treated in Athens, who was subjected basically to disparaging comments because he was a foreigner. But name changing might have boosted their status. It might have established some basis of trust that facilitated their presence in Athens and their work in a Greek city-state, and perhaps also encouraged a sense of belonging. they too were members of the polity of Athens, even if they were not citizens. But still, this practice never erased the Phoenicians' civic or linguistic identities, right? They always provided their state of origin, and they used the Phoenician language on their tombstones. So these bilingual inscriptions assume both a Greek and a Phoenician audience, or readership, I guess I should say. I think one of the things that they demonstrate is that these transplanted Phoenicians in the Greek world activated the Phoenician language to articulate their immigrant identities, even when they changed their name into a Greek one, right? Because any Greek who's walking around seeing this can read the Greek one, but is also going to see that there is a foreign script on this tombstone. Even if they can't read the Phoenician text, they'll know that these are Phoenicians. The tombstones of Sidonians in Athens demonstrate really very similar patterns of name changing and the endurance of Phoenician language. But I want to show two of these tombstones to you because I think they also suggest the existence of a cohesive Sidonian immigrant community. The first one of the two that I want to talk about is the one that you see on this slide. It dates to around 400 BCE. The Greek text, as the majority of inscriptions on these funerary stones of Phoenician immigrants, records just the name, the patronymic, and the city ethnic of the deceased. So it's Artemidoros, son of Heliodoros, the Sidonian. And the Phoenician text elaborates, and it says, this is a stele that was dedicated to the memory among the living of Abtanit, son of Abshamash, the Sidonian. By the way, the name translations follow the same patterns that we've seen. The goddess Tanit is translated into Artemis, and Shamash, which is the sun, S-U-N, is translated into Helios. So, the Phoenician text that we have here actually uses a typical Phoenician expression, not part of Greek practice or Greek funerary epigraphic practice, when it specifies that this is a stele that commemorates the memory of the deceased among the living. And this emphasis on the living is reminiscent of the tombstone of Antipatros that I began with, which was erected by the Sidonian Domselech to commemorate the deceased. The second example of the Sidonian bilingual that I want to share kind of adds to this idea of belonging and our understanding of membership in an immigrant community. This is slightly later. This is a 3rd century BCE text. It's the funerary epitaph of a woman named Acept. And the Greek again provides just the name of her father and the city ethnic, her state of origin. And in Greek, she is Acept, the daughter of Esimselemos, the Sidonian. In Phoenician, she again just provides these three things: her name, her patronymic, and her city state of origin. But there is another line here that doesn't exist in the Greek, which says that this is what Yaton Baal, the son of Eshmun Saloch, the great priest of the god Nergal, erected for me. So Yaton Baal transliterated Acept's name into Greek, Hellenized her father's name by adding the genitive ending, and you can see that in Esim Selemo. And I should note that he is not a blood relation of Acept. Their fathers' names are different, right? So they have different fathers. But he says that he was the one who commissioned this tombstone and identifies himself as the priest of the god Nergal. So what I think may be going on here is that there is that maybe the wider Sidonian community in Athens was responsible for performing the appropriate burial rites and erecting commemorative grave monuments for members of the immigrant community, even when they were not related by blood, as in the case of Acept, and even when they didn't come from the same city-state, as in the case of Antipatros Shem, where he's from Ashkelon, but the person who commissions his tombstone is actually from Sidon. And the other thing that this particular text brings up is the worship of Phoenician deities in Athens. And I think that this can show that the presence of immigrant communities changed the host societies. It introduced foreign gods and traditions to Greek communities. And we have a 4th to 3rd century dedication in Phoenician, inscribed on a marble altar that I think reinforces these ideas. And this text reads, "This is the altar that Ben-Hadad built, son of Baal-Yadon the Saphet, son of Abdeshmun the seer, for Sakon the powerful, blessings be to him." Sakon's worship was attested greatly in Carthage and in Sidon. And the mention of the Saphet, which is an office that was very common in Carthage, maybe suggests that Ben-Hadad was Carthaginian. But at any rate, I think that the text reflects the social changes that were underway, that the religious landscape of the host city was changing because of the presence of immigrants. So these few bilingual texts of the Kyrians and the Sidonians in Athens that I've discussed, I think show that these immigrants maintained some elements of their identity while also at the same time adopting Athenian practices and modes of identification as well. So we see that they usually translated their names into Greek equivalents or Hellenized them. In Greek, their family and civic identity were the primary modes of identification for these Phoenician speakers. In Phoenician, they sometimes used their longer genealogies, but often actually just adopted the Greek custom of just offering their father's name. And at the same time, the appearance of the Phoenician language on these texts shows that language was a marker of identity, or it had become one in this context. So Phoenician-speaking immigrants and residents of Athens basically mixed Phoenician and Greek customs. And this kind of hybridity wasn't just limited to the texts. It also characterized the style and iconography of the monuments themselves. All of the grave stelae that I've talked about thus far, and even those that I haven't, actually are typically Attic, so typically Athenian. And they will sometimes exhibit both Attic and Phoenician motifs. So one common type of the 4th century were these tall, narrow stelae, such as the ones that you see on this slide, which have this finial, acanthus finial on top, and then underneath the texts, either Greek or Phoenician, divided by these 2 rosettes. And this is the style of the tombstone of Artemidoros, which you can see on the left-hand side of the style, and also the 2 Numenii, I don't know, the Numenians, I guess, of Kidion. The grave stele of Antipatros or Shem in Phoenician is different, but it's also typically Greek. So this is the Naiskos style, where you have the pediment on top, a relief, and then the text surrounding the relief. This particular tombstone is a fascinating document, I think, of mobility and migration. The relief, which you can see a close-up here, depicts the body of the deceased lying on a bed, a lion kind of hovering above the corpse, a man standing on the standing on the other side of the body, of the dead body, almost protecting it from the lion. And then in the background, we have a prow of a ship. So some of the elements here are found in Athenian art, funerary art specifically, such as the lion or the ship. But others, such as the dead corpse, are actually really unusual. This is not something that you typically see in Athenian funerary art. So the overall combination of this relief is actually combines both familiar and unfamiliar elements, and it results in this image that's actually pretty astounding and very difficult to interpret. And people have provided different kinds of allegorical or symbolic interpretations based on what we know about Phoenician culture or Phoenician religion. But But it's actually, I think, still pretty difficult to understand what's going on. And if we imagine a Greek looking at this relief, it would be very difficult for them to understand it. And maybe it wouldn't be comprehensible to a Phoenician either, because it does combine a Greek form of the monument and other elements of Greek art. And we can say the exact same thing about the epigram that's underneath this relief. The form of the text is Greek, but the content is not. And whoever composed it didn't speak idiomatic Greek, but adopted this Greek poetic style. And it's interesting because it begins with, let no man wonder at this image, right? So it's actually trying to explain what this image is, but at the end of it, it still remains mysterious. And I think the viewer still wonders what this image or even this epigram really means. So without the correct cultural references, the meaning is kind of lost. But the Phoenician-speaking immigrants, I think, were comfortable operating in this hybrid space that existed between two worlds. Their cultural references might not make sense to the Greeks, but I think they gesture at inclusion in Athenian society. Another example of this kind of hybridization that we see in immigrant communities is this marble stele, again in the shape of an Aiscos. You can see the pediment on top, that dates from the 4th century. It also has a bilingual inscription. Here is the Phoenician, and it just reads Abdeshmun, son of Shalom, and then we don't have the rest. And the Greek that remains is only the letter Xi that we see here. The imagery of this borrows from both Greek and Phoenician art. So we can see that the deceased, according to this reconstruction, is depicted frontally, given the location of the arm and the hand on the surviving fragment. But he is dressed in Attic fashion and holds something in his left hand. And this frontal, rather than profile or quarter view, is not typically Attic, it's actually typically Phoenician. So we see in Phoenician reliefs, individuals portrayed en face and holding something in their left hand and raising their right hand in greeting. So while the figure here is dressed in Greek clothing, in Attic clothing, at the same time, he also is depicted in a more Phoenician artistic style rather than a Greek or Athenian artistic style. And the final funerary inscription that I want to share with you is, I think, kind of gestures at another part of the immigrant experience that we haven't talked about, and that's intermarriage. So this 4th century tombstone of Irene of Byzantium conforms almost completely to Attic iconography. So you see a seated woman lifting her veil, which is a typically Greek gesture. And then opposite her stands another woman holding an infant in her arms. And note that the woman is depicted in profile or three-quarter view, actually three-quarter view here. And the two short inscriptions, right, on the left, we have Irene, the Byzantine in Greek, and on the right, we have Irene, the citizen of Byzantium, in Phoenician. The deceased was probably a Greek from the city-state of Byzantium, living in Athens as a foreign resident. And it looks like her spouse might have been a Phoenician speaker who basically commissioned this tombstone. So Irene belonged to both the Greek and the Phoenician worlds. She was a Greek from Byzantium who had emigrated to Athens, married to a Phoenician speaker who had also emigrated to Athens. And the Phoenician text demonstrates the strength of her husband's ties to his culture, but also Irene's participation in that Phoenician world. And again, this is another bicultural monument like the other ones that we've seen that demonstrates how networks of individuals who moved and migrated transformed the Mediterranean world. Migration resulted in changing modes of identification, the adoption of foreign cultural practices, and the production of these hybrid linguistic and artistic artifacts like the ones that we have seen. And briefly, as my third and final sort of case study, I want to turn to the organization of Phoenician-speaking immigrants in Athens into professional trader associations that appeared for the first time in the 4th century BCE, and they appeared in the 4th century BCE as a result of migration. These kinds of associations were almost like quasi-state associations that acted on behalf of their members. They had the power and the political authority to petition the government of their host state for awards for individual members, or for the association, or for the association as a whole. And they organized these communities of immigrants who came from specific city-states into communities, because these trade associations were centered around the worship of divinities that were particularly prominent in their home of origin, so their city-state of origin. So in a way, these professional associations mediated the immigrant experience. That's partly what I would like to argue. The Kydians formed a trader association that represented Kydian interests in Athens, but also the Kydian community that lived in Athens. This is a stele from Piraeus that dates to 333-332 BCE, and it mentions a group of traders from Kydion on Cyprus who approached the Athenian state with a request. And their request was the right to own land in order specifically to establish a sanctuary of Aphrodite on it. And the text consists of two different decrees. The first one is the decision of the Athenian Council to present the request of the Kydians to the assembly to vote. And then the second one, and this is also all on the handout, records the decision of the assembly. And the assembly decided that the Kydian request was valid, and that they should be given the right to own land for the specific purpose of establishing a sanctuary of Aphrodite on it. Now, Aphrodite and her Phoenician analog Astarte were prominent divinities in Kydion. And the Kydians' choice to build a temple dedicated to Aphrodite reflects the continuation of the religious traditions by immigrant communities. Choosing to continue to worship this goddess basically creates a link between the immigrant Kydians who are in Athens and their home of origin. So overall, it seems that the Kydian Trader Association served as a hub for Kydian immigrants in Athens and functioned as an organization through which this Kydian immigrant community could retain its cultural links to their its mother city. And we see something very similar happening with the Sidonians who lived in Athens. They also had a trader association that served to maintain links to their home of origin, while at the same time actually adopting and adapting Athenian political culture. This bilingual inscription has been dated most recently to the 4th century BCE, and it mentions in Greek a koinon of the Sidonians, so an association of the Sidonians. And the Greek text is very brief. It just says the koinon of the Sidonians for Diopeithes the Sidonian. Diopeithes, he who obeys Zeus or he who persuades Zeus, is a really good translation of the person's name that we find out in the Phoenician text is Shama Baal, which means Baal listens. So again, like we see the same kinds of patterns in the translation of names. And the Phoenician text is much longer. And you can see here a translation of the Phoenician text. Basically, what it does is explain the reasons for the honors given to Shama Baal, which is basically because he benefited the association by outfitting its sanctuary with a court and performing various other tasks that were entrusted to him. And at the very end, the text also tells us why they recorded the honors on a stone stele. And the reason is that they wanted to publicize how well the association treats its members, especially those members who actually benefit the association. The text in Phoenician is really difficult to interpret and is unique. And that's because it makes very little sense in Phoenician, in terms of Phoenician practices. So if we just approach it from a Phoenician perspective, we are going to have a lot of difficulty understanding what this is saying. But if we read it as a Phoenician translation of Athenian honorific practices, then it begins to make sense. In the Phoenician text, the Sidonian Association met as an assembly, like the Athenian assembly would have done. It granted Shama Baal a golden crown of appropriate costs for this time period, which is also exactly what is a typical Athenian award. And it also inscribed the decision of the koinon on a stele in the temple of Baal, just as the Athenians would often inscribe and erect stele in temples. So the very last sentence of the Phoenician text is a direct translation of a phrase that often appears in Athenian texts that record acts of benefaction. So basically, what we have here is the Sidonian Association translating the language that that existed on Attic honorific decrees. And that's why it makes it's difficult to understand if we just think about it from a Phoenician perspective. But even though they adopted Athenian political culture or epigraphic practice as we see it here, at the same time, the association's practices were Sidonian. They are celebrating Shama Baal and honoring him during a ritual feast, the Mazreach, which was a religious feast that was common in Sidon and other places in the Near East, and not just the Phoenicians. So the celebration of a religious festival in Athens maintained the traditions of Sidon, just as building the sanctuary that was dedicated to Aphrodite did exactly the same thing for the Kidians. It kind of reinforced the ties that they had with their home of origin. So these trade associations basically organized these immigrant communities. When a Phoenician trade association from Kidion requested the permission to own land to build a sanctuary, it acted as a representative of the Kidian immigrant community in Athens and acquired benefits for its members that emphasized the connections that they had with their with Kidion, right, with their home in Kidion. And the same was true for the Sidonian koinon that honored its members and advertised what the association could do for them during a religious feast that was common in Sidon. So these professional associations represented their members to Athens, to the Athenian state, and at the same time provided cultural links to their homelands. So just to finish up, I just want to draw a couple of conclusions, just to show how I think or envision migration changed host societies and led immigrants to adopt practices that promoted belonging and membership in the Athenian state. In contrast to most other non-Greek immigrants in Athens, the Phoenicians used their language not only privately, but also on public monuments. The persistence of the Phoenician language displayed on so many tombstones in Athens was an expression of immigrant identities, or became one. And when immigrant communities were formed, like the ones, like the Kidian and the Sidonian ones, they were structured around a civic identity or focused around the divinity that was prominent in their state of origin. Name changing, the adoption of local Athenian styles and the use of the Greek language on these private and public monuments facilitated the inclusion and advancement of immigrants. The establishment of trade associations that were centered around the divinity that was prominent in their home of origin appeared as a result of migration in the 4th century BCE. This is the first time that we see these trade associations. And they organized immigrant communities from a specific city-state, and they mediated their interactions with the host societies. And finally, I think immigrants changed Athens. Phoenician speakers imported their gods, worshipped them, sometimes with permission of the state, served as priests in cults. And I think the presence of these hybrid products, like the tombstones that we see that bore these bilingual inscriptions and bicultural reliefs, changed also the physical landscape of the city and the social landscape of the city as well. So ultimately, I think cases like this one of Phoenician-speaking immigrants in Athens who lived between two worlds show how migration transformed multi-ethnic states like Athens into cosmopolitan ones. And I will stop there, and I will answer questions.
That was super. Thank you so much. I'm just going to get us set up for more of a conversation here.
Sounds good.
All right. Wow. Well, anyway, who wants to go? Anne, I see you beginning to raise your hand. Did you have a question? Oh, no, you were just, okay. Okay, Maria, go ahead.
Thank you very, very much for this, Denise, for this lucid discussion, presentation, with so much wealth of material, and especially from inscriptional sources. And also, I find fascinating what you said about hybridity. One question, it's not a question, it's like more of a topic. I don't have questions. Your argument convinced me, but I liked your idea of hybridity. It's fascinating. Would you like to my question will focus on the Nicocratos. Wait a minute, I must check my handout. So we must, so yes, on the IG 337.
Yeah, but sorry, I just have to go here because then I don't
Yes.
see you for some reason. Oh, because I'm not sharing my screen anymore. That's fine. Yeah.
I'm watching your handout.
Yeah.
What you? I think the date of this particular inscription is 330 BC.
Yeah, 332
Great.
BC.
Great. Well, I see many things going on here. It's the hybridity, as you said, is the fact that we see the demos, the Athenian demos, giving away land, giving and not just accepting a religion like the Thracian goddess Bendis that we see in Plato's Respublica. So what I would like to ask is, do you see that in a way this Athenocentric model of the 5th century, due to new institutions, as you said, like the merchants coming and being organized, do you think that we have something like an erosion, a construction of the Athenocentric system of administration, and in a way anticipating, okay, I'm not saying that it is established, something like of the Hellenistic system after the after Alexander the Great. So in a way, because we say that, oh, the epigonoi of Alexander the Great created a cosmopolitan world. But what you just showed us here is that this concept of you also mentioned the term cosmopolitan started already bearing fruit in 330 BC.
Yeah, thank you for that comment and question, because it's funny the way that this project began, and it's changed along the way, to kind of what you saw today. But one of the motivating factors for me to work on the 4th century BCE was basically because I thought that it's actually a really important period, and this is when we see a lot of the transformations happen. And so, seeing, for example, the appearance of these trade associations, and this is just one example of several that I could have shown, of associations petitioning the Athenian state for rewards, let's say. So, they appear for the first time now, right? So why now? And yeah, I think you are right. So whether it anticipates something else, or whether the changes are underway, or whether we do think that mobility and migration, this is the height of it, and this is like the 4th century BCE. So if that's the case, then things are changing, right? And so, yeah, one of my motivating questions is, why is it happening? How is it changing the landscape here? Like, how is it changing societies?
Mhm.
So yes, I guess absolutely, I would agree with what you said. That, and I don't know that it necessarily sets up what comes later, because that's also just such a different context. But at least we see that I think it does become more cosmopolitan right now, and it does kind of change, multi-ethnic settlements into something different, and it starts now.
And Athens itself starts changing from administrative point of view, from an executive point of view, because it allows other people, immigrants, to own its land.
Yeah, right.
Whereas something like that in the 5th century, I assume, it was out of question.
Yeah, most of the examples of enktesis, which is the right to own land, like the ones that you see here, are from the 4th-century BCE onward. But we actually think that they did give the right to the Thracians originally, the same right to own land to worship Bendis. But then eventually that just becomes absorbed also as part of Athenian state religion too, as you noted. Yeah, so the other thing about the 4th century that I kind of wanted to resist, or maybe argue against when I started this project, was this idea that the 4th century is a century of decline and decay, and you see the disappearance of the institution of the polis or things like that. And I think that it's changing, but I wouldn't call this a decline. I think it's being transformed, and I think it's changing into something else, and it's changing into something else because it's becoming diverse or cosmopolitan in a significant way.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I think that this is the core of your argument. It is very stimulating, because I agree with it. I think that, as you said, 4th century is worthy looking into it and doing research into it, because something is changing. Well, in earlier years, yes, people call it like the century of decay, but it is not a century of decay, because it is a century of transformation. So thank you very much for this argument, and thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you.
Is there anyone else here who would like to ask a question? Well, there are a couple coming in from the YouTube chat. Let me see. Here's one. You talked about hybrid objects, such as the grave stele, that show characteristics of Greek culture and Phoenician. But did these Phoenician immigrants bring anything of their own material culture with them that we can recover? It seems purely Phoenician, I guess, is the point of the question.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and not just in Athens. So the chapter that this is part of, that this presentation is part of, also looks at Phoenicians in Demetrias in Thessaly, and also on the island of Rhodes. And then I'm working currently on another chapter on Phoenicians in Egypt and the central Mediterranean, so Malta, Sicily and Sardinia, and also Carthage. And in all of these cases, we see Phoenician items from the Phoenician mainland. I don't really want to call it mainland, sorry, Phoenician city-states in the Eastern Mediterranean, I should say. We do see them bring objects with them too, like ranging from cooking vessels to statuettes of gods. So yeah, absolutely. In one case in Carthage, we actually have a Kytian who takes his own tombstone to Carthage. So it actually looks like the tombstone of Numenius, the Kytian that I showed you earlier, and that one goes all the way to Carthage, which is very different from what we saw happening in Athens, where they're basically buying the local stones and then creating these hybrid objects. Yeah, yes. So I guess the simple answer is yes, and you do see them taking material culture with them in these other places. For some reason, it's easier to see in Egypt and the Central Mediterranean, and I don't know if that's just because of the interests of the archaeologists who are working in Athens, where we do have Phoenician objects, but I don't think it's as necessarily associated with these communities, and I don't think we necessarily emphasize them or look for them.
That example of the tombstone, the hybrid Greek and Phoenician tombstone brought from Attica, I think, to Carthage is super interesting.
Yeah.
There's a question I was going to ask that is, I think, related. You mentioned that Cyprus might be a true center of bilingual culture, Greek and Phoenician. Are there interesting grave stelae from there as well that are bilingual, and how do they compare to the ones you were talking about?
Yeah, there are, and there are also lots of state documents that are bilingual, which you don't have from Athens, which are also, I think, really interesting. So even Ptolemaic ones that are inscribed in Phoenician and Greek or in the Cypro-syllabic script, which records a Greek language, but it's a different script. So I haven't looked at, I've only looked at that material, I've only looked at it. So I haven't actually researched it or analyzed it. I have an idea about an article on this, but it's so preliminary that I wouldn't even, I don't know that I would dare to even say what I think is going on with this part. Actually, just the state documents is what I want to look at, this Ptolemaic documents, and try and see what the Ptolemies are doing here, but on Cyprus. But yeah, you have lots of bilingual inscriptions from Cyprus, and a bigger variety of them, at least different kinds of bilingual texts, not just funerary ones. So you see similar kinds of things in terms of the identification. So sometimes they provide longer genealogies. You see the same kind of name changing practices. Yeah, I'm trying to think of what else, but yeah.
Oops. Well, it's about time to wrap it up. Any final quick question or comments? Please just speak up here.
There's some questions in the chat. Do you want me to read?
There are, but there are quite a few, so I don't think that we can.
I think I can summarize.
Treat them fairly.
Okay.
Without going too far over time. But if there's one you'd like to pick out, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I just would say, just this, do you see similar hybrid communities elsewhere in Sicily or northern Greece? And I guess I just want to say yes to that. And I think it's important to, I guess the reason I wanted to answer that question from Janet is that it's important to recognize that this isn't just happening in Athens, because we often just think about Athens and concentrate on Athens, and it's very, it's a big center and it's a multi-ethnic center. But in fact, we see these in almost everywhere in the Mediterranean. So I just want to say that, because I think that that's really important to acknowledge. This is not unique. What's going on here is actually part of a much larger phenomenon.
Great. Well, we'll look forward to reading your book when it comes out, to learn much more about all of this. So thank you again for joining us so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all out there.